Would you be able to survive the horrors of 1792? What if you were told that the most terrifying place in London wasn't a prison, but a hospital? The year is 1792. London is the beating heart of a sprawling empire, a metropolis of smoke, wealth, and a misery so profound it defies imagination. The city air is thick, a miasma of burnt coal, the fetid Thames, and the smell of thousands of bodies, living and dead, piled up in narrow alleyways. It is an era that prides itself on its reason, the age of enlightenment, where philosophers debate the rights of man. Yet, just steps from the fashionable tea rooms and aristocratic palaces stands a monument to its antithesis. It is not a prison nor a dungeon, though it contains more suffering than the Tower of London. It is the Royal Hospital of Bedlam, but to Londoners, to the world, it has only one name: Bedlam. And in 1792, Bedlam is not merely an asylum for the lunatics. It is the city's most infamous and shocking tourist attraction. For just 1 penny, any citizen with a strong stomach can buy a ticket. What they are buying is not charity or visitation. They are buying the right to mock. They are paying to enter a human zoo where the exhibits are men and women chained together, stripped of their sanity and dignity. Entire families make this a Sunday outing. Young gentlemen take their ladies to laugh at Mad Tom, who proclaims himself king, or to cringe in feigned horror at the woman weeping in a corner, naked and filthy. The gates of Bedlam do not open for compassion. They open for cruel entertainment, a spectacle of human depravity packaged as popular amusement. Upon paying their penny and passing through the imposing gates, what visitors saw was a horror that defied description, but which, to the sensibilities of the time, was perfectly normal. The stench was the first thing that struck them, a physical wall of human excrement, rotting straw, rancid sweat, and disease. It was the smell of humanity concentrated and abandoned. And then, the sound, a cacophonous chorus that would haunt anyone's nightmares. Shrill screams, low, guttural wails, the rhythmic rattling of chains against stone, and, most disturbing of all, the maniacal laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. The main galleries were long corridors lined with cells. But cells is a generous term. They were cages. The patients, or inmates, were on full display. Many were half-naked, dressed in filthy rags that barely covered their modesty, if they had any. Some were chained directly to the cold stone walls, the short chains digging into their ankles and wrists, the skin underneath ulcerated and infected. The floor was covered in a disgusting mixture of straw and excrement. Visitors didn't just see this. They interacted. They poked patients with canes, threw scraps of food, and shouted insults to provoke a reaction. And the treatments, when they occurred, were part of the spectacle. There was no attempt to hide the brutality of the medicine of the time. Visitors could watch as a patient was tied to a chair and bled by a barber surgeon, the dark blood gushing into a bowl, in the belief that this would drain the bad humors. They could see patients being forcibly immersed in tubs of ice water until they nearly drowned, a shock intended to awaken reason. Violent purges, where patients were forced to ingest potent emetics until they vomited violently, were routine. All of this was done in full view of everyone, a spectacle of the grotesque that served both as a warning and as entertainment. But on a particularly damp autumn day in 1792, a different kind of visitor crossed the threshold of Bedlam. We won't call him by his real name, as his records were purposefully obscured, but we can call him Edward. Edward wasn't an idle aristocrat seeking cheap thrills. He was a young doctor, a man of the Enlightenment, who had read the new French treatises on moral treatment. He didn't come with a penny to laugh at. He came with a notebook and a heavy soul, hoping to find something. Perhaps a glimpse of humanity to save, or perhaps just to confirm his worst fears about the profession he had chosen. While the other visitors pointed and laughed, Edward observed with a clinical and horrified gaze. He didn't see beasts, he saw people. He noticed the details the others ignored. The calloused hands of the man who chained himself, suggesting a life of hard work. The regional accent in the murmur of the catatonic woman, betraying her origins. And it was then that a cold and disconcerting realization began to form in his mind. He looked at the dozens of faces on display. Dirty, toothless faces, scarred by smallpox and hard labor. They were the faces of workers, beggars, prostitutes, discharged soldiers. They were, without exception, the faces of the poor. In a city as class-divided as London, where birth determined destiny, madness seemed to be an illness exclusive to the lower class. This observation did not seem correct to him. Madness, he knew, did not respect social hierarchy. Where, he wondered, where were the lunatics of the elite? Consumed by this unsettling question, Edward began to investigate. He wasn't content with the public galleries. He wandered through the more distant corridors, away from the noise of the crowd. He tried to open doors that were visibly locked, not with the simple bolts of the patient's cells, but with heavy, expensive locks. In a basement corridor, or perhaps climbing a narrow staircase hidden behind a tapestry, he found an area that was fundamentally different. The air was colder. The silence was almost total, broken only by the echo of his own footsteps. He found a guard, a burly man with a face that seemed carved from granite, guarding a solid oak door. This guard was not like the other caretakers in the public ward, who were little more than drunken brutes. This man was alert, well-dressed, and armed. Edward, pretending to be a lost visitor, asked what lay beyond the door. The reaction was immediate and hostile. The guard grabbed him by the collar, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "This is a private area," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "For special patients, not for your eyes." The hostility, the secrecy, the very solidity of that door, all confirmed Edward's suspicions. Later, hidden in the shadows of the courtyard, he overheard two cleaning staff whispering. They spoke fearfully of the silent wing. They spoke of unmarked carriages arriving in the middle of the night. They spoke of patients who came in but never came out, and whose names were never recorded in the public books. The secrecy wasn't about special patients in the sense of being dangerous. It was about being special in a way that London valued most. They were rich. The secret that Bedlam had so fiercely guarded, the secret kept behind that oak door, was a rotten truth about the hypocrisy at the heart of Georgian society. The silent wing was not for the poor wretches that society had discarded. It was for those whom society could not. Risk the silent wing was a ward for the aristocracy. It was the place where the upper bourgeoisie sent their inconveniences. Madness, it seemed, was indeed democratic in its affliction, but its treatment was rigidly divided by class. If a peasant went mad, he was chained in a public gallery for everyone's amusement. If a duke's son suffered from melancholy, or if his wife proved rebellious and hysterical, perhaps reading too many books or refusing to be a docile wife, or if an heir was born with a physical or mental disability that might shame the lineage, they were not treated. They were hidden. The function of the silent wing was not healing, it was social erasure. In an age obsessed with reputation, lineage, and public appearance, A defective relative was a scandal that could ruin fortunes and political alliances. Bedlam, for an exorbitant price, offered the perfect solution: a discreet and permanent disappearance. The family could announce a sudden illness or an extended trip to the mainland, while the individual in question was swallowed alive by the silent walls of the asylum. Edward knew he couldn't leave. What he had heard and suspected gnawed at him from the inside. He spent days observing the guard of the silent wing, noting his routine, his weakness for gin. One night, with a handful of silver coins weighing heavily in his pocket, an amount that represented a month's salary for the guard, Edward made his move. The clinking of the coins was more eloquent than any words. The guard hesitated, looked both ways down the dark corridor, and with a grunt, accepted the bribe. The heavy lock turned with a deafening clack. The door opened. What Edward found was not the chaos of the public wing. It was something far worse. It was a terrifying silence, a tomb-like silence. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of mold, medicine, and a sickly stillness. Unlike the open galleries, here was a corridor of private rooms, each with a solid wooden door. The guard let him into one of these rooms, holding the lantern. The flickering light revealed a scene of Gothic horror. On a bed of decent appearance, but stained, lay a figure. Judging by the quality of the nightgown, now in tatters, it was clearly someone of noble birth. But she was chained, not to the wall, but to the bed frame itself, with polished brass chains. She was in total isolation, the room's window boarded up. She didn't scream. Her eyes were open, but empty, glazed by heavy, constant doses of laudanum. This was the true cruelty of the system. In the public ward, patients had each other, had a glimpse of heaven, however poor it might be. Here, the rich were buried alive in deafening silence, in perpetual darkness, living in worse conditions than the poor, precisely because no one would ever see them. Their wealth only bought them a deeper level of hell. While the guard was distracted with a bottle, Edward crept deeper. He found what appeared to be the office of the chief physician of that ward. On the desk, in the light of his flashlight, he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. They were diaries, meticulously detailed diaries, not of cures, but of experimentation. Far from any public scrutiny, from any ethics committee, which didn't exist, the doctors at Bedlam used their wealthy and secretive patients as lab rats. Edward read notes that made him want to vomit. There were descriptions of sadistic treatments, inflicted not out of necessity, but out of pure, twisted scientific curiosity. He read about the spinning chair, a device where patients were strapped in and spun at incredible speeds until blood gushed from their noses and ears, on the theory that this would reorganize the brain. He read about bubble therapies, where caustic chemicals were applied to shaved scalps to create painful blisters, in the hope that the vapors of madness would escape. There were records of lethal dosages of narcotics, administered simply to see how much resistance the noble subject demonstrated compared to the commoner. These patients, shielded from scandal outside, became the private playground for medicine's darkest impulse. What happened in the silent wing wasn't treatment, and it wasn't even the brutal confinement of the public ward. It was torture, systematic and documented. Edward could barely breathe. He needed to understand the motivation. The cruelty was obvious, but the system was complex. He found another set of books, these not medical, but financial. And then everything became clear. The silent wing wasn't just a social secret. It was an extortion scheme. Bedlam's director, a man with deep connections in high society, had created a corrupt profit-making machine. Noble families paid fortunes, not to cure their relatives, but to guarantee two things. First, their absolute silence, and, second, their permanent disappearance. The financial records showed exorbitant quarterly payments from some of England's most famous names. They were essentially ransom payments in reverse. One paid toto maintain the person imprisoned. The director had the power to destroy reputations with a single rumor. If a family hesitated to pay, there was always the veiled threat that their inconvenient relative could be transferred to the public ward, to be displayed alongside the beggars, so that the whole world could see the stain on the family lineage. Bedlam was not just an asylum. It was a bank that traded in human shame. Secrecy was its currency, and the silent suffering of wealthy patients was its vault. Trembling with rage and fear, Edward frantically copied as much information as he could, stuffing pages from financial and medical diaries into his coat. He left Bedlam that night, not as a doctor, but as a witness to a crime against humanity. Knowing that no respectable newspaper would dare print such accusations against London's most powerful families, he used what little money he had left to pay a clandestine printing press. A few days later, an anonymous pamphlet began circulating in London's cafes and salons. It was titled, "The Secret of Bedlam's Hidden Rich Ward." The effect was instantaneous, but not in the way Edward had hoped. The scandal that shocked London was not the revelation of cruelty. After all, everyone knew Bedlam was a cruel place. They paid a penny to see that cruelty. The shock was the hypocrisy. The revelation that the elite, who feigned so much virtue and decorum, were just as flawed as the poor they despised. The scandal was that the aristocrats were hiding their lunatics in the gloomy luxury of secrecy, while the poor were displayed for public ridicule. The middle class felt cheated. They were paying to see the zoo, but were not shown the most exotic and valuable exhibits. The outrage was not moral, it was social. The uproar caused by the pamphlet was enough to force action, albeit superficial. The Parliament, composed of men whose own cousins or aunts might have been in that ward, formed an investigative committee. It was, as expected, a farce. Witnesses were intimidated, records disappeared. The director of Bedlam was very efficient at burning the books before the investigators arrived, and the final report was inconclusive. However, the secret was exposed. The silent ward was quietly closed. Its few survived. Patients were transferred to private asylums in the countryside, or simply locked in the attics of their own ancestral homes. The director was retired with a generous pension. Edward, if that was indeed his name, disappeared, perhaps fleeing to France or America, or perhaps permanently silenced by those he exposed. And Bedlam? Bedlam continued. The horrors of the public ward, the human zoo for which one paid a penny, continued for decades. The scandal of the secret ward was only a brief interruption. True reform, moral treatment, the radical idea that the mentally ill were sick people and not beasts was still very, very far on the horizon. The dark secret of the rich had been exposed, but Bedlam's legacy, as a stain on the soul of London and a shameful chapter in the history of medicine, was only beginning to be written. If you were moved by this story, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you liked most. Your opinion is very important to us. Share this video with someone who needs an inspiring story. Until next time!